The celebration of the funeral in the Catholic Church is done in 3 parts. The first part is the vigil service, usually done the night before the funeral mass or the funeral celebration. The second part is the Mass itself, in which we gather to celebrate the Eucharist and pray for the deceased. And the third is the graveside service, in which the family says their final farewells and they leave the person to be laid to rest. And in that whole process, there are a lot of very important things that we are reminded of as points of faith. And so, in preparing for a funeral, there are a few things I'd like people to remember, one of which is, don't have nothing. There are people who would say on occasion, I don't need a funeral, just when I die, just bury me and put me in the ground. I don't need a funeral. And when you hear people say that, rightly or wrongly, that in many ways that's kind of a misplaced humility, because it comes from a very popular understanding that funerals are all about the deceased, which to a certain degree they are. But it's not just simply about the deceased. It is also about prayer and intercession for the deceased. So when a person says, I don't need a funeral, that comes from a misunderstanding of funerals. I don't need something that's all about me, and comes from that misunderstanding that funerals or my funeral is about me. The deceased needs the prayers of intercession. The family needs the grace of the Eucharist as they say goodbye to a loved one. We need to say goodbye as families, as individuals, and as a community of faith. And we need, as the living, to be nourished by the Eucharist and by the Mass on this occasion of death, in which we are given assurances of faith, because death is a very important event in someone's life. It's a very sad event for the family, and it's a time when we need to be nourished by the faith. So, when a person passes away, when a loved one has died, don't have nothing. Celebrate that faith in anticipation of the resurrection, even as we mourn the death of a loved one. Second, funerals are best if they are done soon. Every now and again, I have done a funeral in which the person died a month ago or a while ago, and the person is either cremated so that they can be, for lack of a better way of putting it, stored longer until the funeral can take place, or if the family has the money to pay for it, the deceased is kept on ice until everybody can put it into their busy schedule to be present at the funeral. I would say don't wait until everyone can make it. When you think about it, a family is mourning the loss of a loved one. But now people are putting pressure on them to schedule the funeral so that everyone can make it. Have the funeral within a few days. Some, it's about a week after the person has died. And if it is important to family and friends, they will be there, rather than constantly accommodate everyone else's busy schedule. But don't keep the deceased waiting or on ice until everyone can make it. Lay them to rest and bury the dead soon, because burying the dead is one of the corporal works of mercy, and it is our duty to provide that for the deceased, and it's best to be done soon. Third, it's best if the remains are present at the funeral, and it is what will distinguish a funeral from a memorial service. If the remains are not present, it is simply a memorial service. If the remains are present in the casket or in the urn, then it is a funeral service. And a funeral service includes the rite of final commendation, in which the remains are blessed in preparation for burial and in anticipation for resurrection. So when you think about it, a memorial is more about the deceased. A funeral is about intercession and prayer and God's mercy. In a funeral, the church joins family and friends in saying goodbye to a beloved brother or sister or son or daughter. Just as the church welcomed them in baptism to the church, now the church says farewell. And in that, there are symbols that reflect and call to mind the welcome the church made to the deceased, even as now the church is saying farewell. And it shows the proverbial circle of life, not birth and rebirth as an incarnation, but the circle from baptism to the funeral, from birth to death, from rebirth in baptism to resurrection in eternal life. And here are some of those symbols that call to mind the baptism of the deceased. Well, first, when a person, especially if they're baptized as an infant, they are carried into the church and presented by the family. Now the deceased, in the casket or in the urn, are carried into the church and presented one last time to the church by their family. When a person is baptized, they are clothed in a white garment. In a funeral, the casket is draped in a white garment that is the pall. When one is baptized, a candle is lit from the Easter or Paschal candle, a candle that every year is lit on the occasion of the Easter Vigil in celebration of the resurrection of Christ. So the baptismal candle is lit from the Easter or Paschal candle, and now that candle is lit and present during the funeral Mass. And of course, what would baptism be without holy water? That's what baptism means, water immersion. And when one is baptized, they are sprinkled or poured onto by water. And at a funeral, at the vigil, they are blessed with holy water. At the funeral Mass, as they are welcomed into the church, they are sprinkled with holy water. At the final commendation at the end of Mass, they are sprinkled with holy water. And as they are taken out of the church, the last gesture before they are taken out the doors of the church, they are sprinkled with holy water. And when they arrive at the final place of rest, they are sprinkled again with holy water as a reminder of the baptism they celebrated, which ultimately is done in anticipation of this moment when one passes from this life to the next. Also, you look at the vestments that the priest wears at a funeral. It is not unheard of that the priest will wear black, which is a symbol of humility and mourning, but more often than not, the colors of a funeral will be white, symbolizing new life, the new life that we all hope for and pray for. In deference to the deceased in a funeral Mass, we are praying that they be received into eternal life, and the colors worn by the priest reflect this. But especially it's important that the remains be present for the funeral Mass and the funeral celebration in general, because it also indicates that the deceased is with us in this celebration. They are present as we celebrate the Mass one last time in their presence. And we've often heard of a funeral service as referring to a person being carried into the church feet first. And they, in fact, are processed into the church feet first. Why? Because if you picture in that position, feet first, if they were to be sitting up or the remains propped up from that position, they would be facing the sanctuary. And so in many ways, they are there celebrating the Mass with us as members of the congregation, in which death is merely a curtain or a veil that separates us as a church, as a community of faith. If the deceased is a priest, he's actually brought in head first, in which if he were to be propped up, he would be facing the congregation as a celebrant or a concelebrant would in celebrating this sacrament of Holy Mass. And so having the deceased present is also very important because they are still a part of the community that is the church. All that separates us is death, which the prophet Isaiah speaks of not as a wall or a door, but as a veil. And they are still a part of our community of faith, and their presence, before being taken to the place of rest, can have important reminders for those who are there to pray for their soul, be present for them in this last celebration before they are taken to their place of rest. One of the grand traditions of the Catholic Church is the honor that it gives to the saints. And to give you an idea of just how the Church approaches the way it honors the saints, let me offer a parallel. One way or another, all of us are historical figures, people of history, insofar as we live, we work, and we die during a period in history. But there are those whose contribution to history, or whose lives were so extraordinary, whether it be in a nation, the church, a local community, that we honor their life and we teach their lives and their examples to our children in history class. Well, in the same way, people of faith in the Catholic Church, we all belong to the Catholic faith, and that includes the faithful departed. We don't believe that the community of faith is separated by death. The faithful departed are still a part of our community of faith, and we emulate those examples of faith and holiness throughout our history that the Church has determined to be worthy of telling their story, honoring their life and their example and their contributions to the progress and history of the faith and the Catholic Church. And so when we honor the saints, we do so in different ways, but especially we remember them on their feast days, which more often than not traditionally is the day in which they died. There are some exceptions, but it's usually we honor their feast day on the day in which that particular saint died. And there are multiple saints that can be remembered on any given day throughout the year. One good resource is a 4-volume work called Butler's Lives of the Saints, in which, starting with January 1st and going to December 31st, it gives a review of the life of the saints who are honored or remembered on those particular days of the year. And even there, that work, Butler's Lives of the Saints, is outdated because since its publication, there are new saints that have been added to the collection of saints that we honor as a Catholic Church. But I believe in many ways that we all have various patron saints. And I remember that when I am working with people who are either preparing for the death of a loved one or who are mourning the passing of a loved one. Now, sometimes we can determine our own personal patron saints based upon, say, our name. Like my name is William Charles Nicholas. And while there are 17 St. Williams, I claim as a patron St. William of Gellone, whose feast day is May 28th. Charles Borromeo is the saint of my middle name, and Nicholas of Myra, a very important saint where Christmas is concerned, for the saint of my last name, Nicholas. But there can be other ways in which we recognize patron saints, the patron saint of our parish growing up, or a school that we have attended if we attended Catholic school. Our confirmation name, what was the saint we named ourselves after when we were confirmed? But also the feast days of these saints, the day of our birth. What was the feast day? Who was celebrating a feast day on the day we were born? The day of our baptism, the day of our confirmation, the date of our wedding anniversary, or in my case, the day of my ordination, which my feast day of ordination is the feast of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. But in working with people in preparing for the death of a loved one or in mourning the death of a loved one, I like to remind the families that all of us have an unknown patron saint, known only to God and that particular saint, but eventually will become known to us and known to our families. And that is the saint who's celebrating a feast day on the day that we die. And it gives, I believe, a sense of comfort and a sense of God's presence and of a saint's interceding for us and praying for us all our lives without us really knowing it. And that person will be made known on the day we die. For example, my grandfather passed away on the feast day of St. Martha. So St. Martha was his unknown patron saint, which we know now because it was her feast day on the day he died. And so I think it's an important thing to remember and perhaps add to the manner in which we as a people of faith prepare for the death of a loved one and prepare to say farewell in the funeral liturgies of the Catholic Church. It's that there has been an unknown patron saint praying for us all throughout our lives, known only to God and that saint. But it will eventually be made known to us, and for all we know, that saint will be the first one with Christ to welcome us when we are called by God from this life to the next.